Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There's more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 30,405 people from 157 countries and is supported by 422 organizations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts engaged in defending women's rights. If you would like to join in and work with us, there's a volunteer form on our website, and you can also email info@womensdeclaration.com. This week, we have Kara Dansky from the USA. She's going to be talking about the American GRA, and it's called the Global Respect Act, but she's going to be telling us about that. Then we're going to hear from Emma Bateman from the UK Green Party. She's going to be talking about the Green Party's position on women's sex-based rights. After that, we'll hear from Arusi Unda from Mexico, who will talk about sexual and reproductive exploitation in Mexico, the only political scenario when they suddenly know what a woman is. And the fourth speaker today is Hale Ake from Turkey, and she's going to be talking about women confronting queer feminism in Turkey. I'm really pleased now to introduce Kara Dansky, who will be talking about the American GRA. Kara Dansky is a public speaker, writer, and consultant who is committed to protecting the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls on the basis of sex in law and throughout society. In November 2021, she published the groundbreaking work, The Abolition of Sex: How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. She currently serves as president of the US chapter of Women's Declaration International, WDI, which seeks to promote the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. She served on the board of Women's Liberation Front, WOLF, from 2016 to 20. Kara is also an attorney with a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a BA from the Johns Hopkins University, and an extensive background in criminal justice law and policy. So thank you so much, Kara, and over to you.
A big thank you to Vaishnavi Sundar, who called our attention to what is called the Global Respect Act, or GRA. The US chapter is gravely concerned about the implications of this bill and what it will mean for declaration signatories. And we've put together a position paper on it, and I'll be reading from that position paper today. I won't read the whole thing because it's too long, but you can find it on our website. The American GRA, barring feminists from entry into the US. Introduction. A bill is pending in the US Congress called the Global Respect Act. The US chapter of Women's Declaration International is gravely concerned that this legislation, if enacted, will be used to bar feminists all over the world from entering the United States. The purpose of this paper is to explain the reasoning behind this concern. In 2004, the United Kingdom adopted the Gender Recognition Act, or as it is commonly known, the GRA. This law permits, quote, a person of either gender to make an application for a gender recognition certificate on the basis of A, living in the other gender, or B, having changed gender under the law of a country or territory outside the United Kingdom. It is generally understood that the purpose of this law was to enable same-sex couples to marry, as same-sex marriage was not legal in the UK at the time. There are, as of time of writing, numerous campaigns to repeal the GRA on the ground that allowing men to be legally recognized as women has caused numerous harms to women and children. You can read about some of these efforts online, but for now, the UK's GRA remains the law. Stateside, the Global Respect Act passed in the House of Representatives in February 2022 and is now before the Senate. The American GRA is not the same as the UK GRA. It does not, for example, create a gender recognition certificate, but we believe it is not an accident or a coincidence that its acronym is GRA. The American GRA was introduced in the US House of Representatives on May 25th, 2021 by David Cicilline, a Democrat from Rhode Island. Representative Cicilline was also responsible for introducing the so-called Equality Act in the US House in 2021. This bill would eradicate the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls by redefining the word sex to include gender identity throughout US civil rights law. Online, you can find a video, which we link to in the paper, of Julia Beck's 2019 testimony concerning the Violence Against Women Act, where she defends the right of women to access female-only spaces. Starting at around 3 minutes, 28 seconds of the video, Representative Cicilline speaks about her with blatant contempt and disdain and accuses her of, quote, deciding the sexual orientation and gender identity of every person in our country. This man's hatred of women and of lesbians in particular is fully on display in this video. The American GRA, which will be addressed in detail below, contains some great provisions that would materially benefit the rights of same-sex attracted people of both sexes, which are under threat globally. It would, for example, bar entry to the US of people who engage in the torture, prolonged detention, or disappearance of gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. There are far too many harrowing stories, for example, of lesbian individuals and couples being tortured and murdered because of their sexual orientation. And in the paper, we link to a story from earlier this year about a lesbian couple from Texas being tortured, dismembered, and killed in Mexico, a story about a young woman in Cameroon that discusses the fact that, quote, from South Africa to India and Ecuador, gay people are subjected to corrective rape by their families, strangers, and vigilantes who believe that homosexuality is a mental illness that needs to be cured. We also link to an attack on a lesbian couple that took place on a bus in London in 2019. The US is not immune to anti-lesbian and anti-gay violence, of course. We link to an attack that took place on the New York City subway in 2018. The point here, though, is that homophobic and lesbophobic violence and torture are rampant all over the world, and that barring entry to the United States of people who engage in it is a good thing. If the bill were limited to barring entry into the US of people who engage in homophobic and lesbophobic torture, prolonged detention, or disappearance, it would have our support. The problem with this particular bill, however, is that it goes further. In addition to barring entry into the US of people who engage in actual human rights abuses, the bill would also bar entry into the US of anyone who, quote, is responsible for or complicit in other flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of, quote, LGBTQI persons. In the UK, the Green Party was presented with a motion to suspend or expel signatories to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights from the party. I'm sure Emma will clarify if I get any of this wrong. That motion was ruled out of order on March 5th during the party's spring conference. However, only 57.3% of voting members voted not to have the motion be heard, meaning that a full 42.7% of voting members voted in favor of the motion proceeding. WDI USA is gravely concerned that the American GRA could easily be used to justify barring entry into the US of signatories to the Declaration. In fact, that may have been its original intent. Bill text and analysis. The stated purpose of the American GRA is, quote, to impose sanctions on foreign persons responsible for violations of internationally recognized human rights against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex, LGBTQI, individuals, and for other purposes. The bill does not contain any definitions of the words lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or intersex. Representative Cicilline appears to think that Americans simply know what these words mean and that we all share the same understandings of their definitions. When the US House of Representatives voted to pass the bill in February 2022, 221 Democratic representatives and 6 Republican representatives appear to have made the same assumption. Of course, everyone knows what the words lesbian, gay, and bisexual people mean. They relate to people who are attracted to members of the same sex or to both sexes. Most Americans are probably not familiar with the term intersex. According to the Intersex Society of North America, this is a general term used for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with a reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't seem to fit the typical definitions of female or male. All members of each of these groups, lesbians, gay males, bisexuals, and persons with intersex conditions, deserve protections from human rights abuses. The fact that neither transgender nor queer is defined in this bill is extremely alarming. These words are never defined with any clarity, and most Americans have no idea what they mean. Enshrining the acronym LGBTQI in law and treating it as a monolith harms all of the acronym's constituent groups other than the T and the Q, which again are not defined. The bill goes on to make several findings, which I am going to skip for purposes of today, to say we agree with all of the bill's findings to the extent that they apply to lesbian, gay, and bisexual people and to people with intersex conditions. However, without knowing what the words transgender and queer mean, we cannot take a position on whether we agree with the bill's findings with respect to people who claim to identify as falling within those categories. Section 3 of the bill is titled Sanctions on Individuals Responsible for Violations of Human Rights Against LGBTQI People. It would obligate the US president to transmit a list of, quote, foreign people to the appropriate congressional committees. And I can say what those are if anybody would like. The phrase foreign people is not defined with reference to any particular geographic location or citizenship status. Does it include lawful permanent residents of the US who are not US citizens? Could it include people who were born overseas and have become naturalized US citizens? Individuals with dual citizenship? What about Americans living abroad? The fact that this bill is aimed at so-called foreign people without defining that term further fuels our speculation that it is aimed at signatories to the Declaration, setting aside the fact that the phrase foreign people without explanation comes off as horrifically xenophobic. The people on the list must, quote, based on credible information, including information obtained by other countries or by non-governmental organizations that monitor violations of human rights, have engaged in a specified list of activities with respect to so-called LGBTQI people. In order to be placed on the list, a person must be, quote, responsible for or complicit in with respect to persons based on actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics, none of which are defined, one or more of the following activities: torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges and trial, or causing the disappearance of such persons by the abduction and clandestine detention of such persons. The bill does not say what constitutes credible information or how the president might demonstrate that the information used to justify placement on the list is credible. Because the information can be provided by non-governmental organizations, presumably the president could consider information coming from organizations like the ACLU, Human Rights Campaign, or Stonewall in making the determinations as to who is placed on the list. A person can also be placed on the list if he or she is involved in, quote, another flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or security of such LGBTQI persons. Finally, a person can earn a spot on the list if he or she, quote, acted as an agent of or on behalf of a foreign person in a matter relating to any of the above activities. The bill does not define the word agent. These are the provisions that we find to be the most chilling and the strongest evidence that this bill is targeted at Declaration signatories, and even if it is not targeted at Declaration signatories, that it could be easily used to bar entry to the US of Declaration signatories based on our commitment to the sex-based rights of women and girls, because a commitment to the sex-based rights of women and girls is routinely characterized as a denial of the rights of people who claim to identify as trans or queer. We are also gravely concerned that a US signatory could be placed on the list on the basis of the agent provision. US signatories cannot be placed on the list on the basis of any other provision of the bill because presumably we are not foreign people as far as the US government is concerned. But if we can be characterized as acting as an agent of or on behalf of a foreign person, that could easily provide a rationale for placing US signatories on the list. The list would be made public via the Federal Register, but the president may also maintain a classified list upon making the following determinations. One, that it is vital for the national security interests of the US to do so. And two, the use of such a classified list would not undermine the overall purpose of the bill to publicly identify foreign persons who engaged in the conduct listed in order to increase accountability for such conduct. This means that the list would be made publicly available to anyone and also makes the bill's purpose clear, to publicly identify persons who engaged in the conduct listed in order to increase accountability for such conduct. To be clear, we are perfectly comfortable holding accountable people who engage in actual human rights abuses. Our concern is that this is Representative Ciceline's way of saying, TERFs, you will be held publicly accountable for committing the crime of fighting for the sex-based rights of women and girls. Notably, although the list itself is to be made publicly available, there are no provisions in the bill requiring that the people on the list themselves be notified. Anyone deemed worthy of being on the list could easily be on the list without knowing it. In order to know that one is on the list, one would have to first know about this law, then find the section of the Federal Register where the list is published, and then check it every day to see if you are on it. Very few people in the US, let alone anywhere else in the world, even know what the Federal Register is, let alone where to find it. Next, people can be removed from the list if the president finds any of the following. New credible information is discovered confirming that the person did not in fact engage in the activity for which the person was included in the list initially. The person has been prosecuted appropriately for the activity in which the person engaged. The person has credibly demonstrated a significant change in behavior, paid an appropriate consequence for the activities in which the person engaged, or has credibly committed not to engage in the activities. It is not at all clear what constitutes an appropriate prosecution. If, hypothetically, a Scottish signatory was charged with a hate crime for the crime of tweeting an image of a suffrage ribbon and the charges were subsequently dropped, would that constitute an appropriate prosecution? If, hypothetically, a Welsh signatory was detained for 13 hours on suspicion of having committed a hate crime while her home was searched and her feminist books seized, would that be enough to justify her removal from the list? The section on demonstrating a significant change in behavior, paying appropriate consequences for activities engaged in, and credibly committing not to engage in the activities is perhaps even more chilling. How much penance exactly must women demonstrate in order to justify removal from the list? Would publicly renouncing the declaration be sufficient? Must women grovel for forgiveness as well? Under this bill, all individuals placed on the list and each immediate family member, nowhere defined, of said individuals are inadmissible to the United States, ineligible to receive a visa or other documentation to enter the United States, and otherwise ineligible to be admitted into the US or receive any other benefit under the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the law that governs immigration in the US. Any visa that had previously been granted to any person on the list or to any such person's immediate family members is to be revoked effective immediately, regardless of when it was granted, and any other valid visa or entry documentation that the person possesses is to be automatically canceled. The bill then states that it is, quote, the sense of Congress that the president should impose additional targeted sanctions with respect to people on the list in order to push for accountability for flagrant denials of the right to life, liberty, or security of LGBTQI persons. The bill does not enumerate any examples of such sanctions. We do not know, for example, if the president could freeze the US bank accounts of people on the list, or if the president could pressure people's own governments to punish them. The president has authority over the US Office of Customs and Border Protection. Could this agency, in addition to refusing people entry to the US, also detain them in immigration detention facilities? This is entirely plausible as a practical matter. A person attempting to enter the US on a visa without knowing that he or she or his or her family member has been placed on the list could easily be stopped by customs officials at the airport and detained. Under the bill, the president would have the authority to waive the application of sanctions if he or she finds that it is in the national security interests of the US to do so, strongly suggesting that actual abusers of the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and intersex people, such as the Iranian regime that executed 2 gay men earlier this year, could be let off the hook. Context and history. In this section, we explain exactly why we are concerned that the bill will be used to justify banning entry to the US of signatories to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. As has already been explained, the UK Green Party recently considered a motion that would have explicitly suspended or expelled Declaration signatories from the party. As we know, after signing the Declaration, philosophy professor Kathleen Stock was subjected to what she has referred to as a medieval experience of campus ostracism and protests. Stock eventually felt compelled to leave her job because of the severity of the harassment. So the idea that signing the Declaration ought to be grounds for punishment is not novel. In the introduction, we linked to Julia Beck's 2019 testimony regarding the Violence Against Women Act and the importance of women-only spaces. That was in March of 2019. We also link to her video testifying against the Equality Act, which Representative Cicilline strongly supports, in April of that same year. Both hearings were before the US House Judiciary Committee, on which David Cicilline serves. He listened to her testimony on both occasions. Both times, she was introduced as a member of the Women's Liberation Front and a registered Democrat. So we know that Representative Cicilline knew about Wolf and therefore about the feminist critique of gender identity, at least as early as the spring of 2019. Also in 2019, the Declaration was launched in the UK, and what was then called the Women's Human Rights Campaign, now Women's Declaration International, was born. The US chapter of that organization was launched in August of 2020 and has been actively promoting the Declaration in the US ever since. In February 2021, Representative Cicilline tweeted, "In 2021, every American should be treated with dignity and respect. After so many years of waiting for full LGBTQ equality, the time has come, #Equality Act." The group Feminists in Struggle responded, "The Equality Act needs to be amended to protect women and girls' sex-based rights. It redefines sex as gender identity, thereby removing legal protections on the basis of sex. Ask your US representative and senators to support FIST's feminist amendments to the Equality Act." The US chapter of WDI does not support the FIST proposed amendments because we have our alternative amendments. Nonetheless, we are including this information because we appreciate FIST's contribution to the movement to protect women's sex-based rights, and we think that this exchange provides additional evidence that Representative Cicilline has known about the feminist critique of gender identity for some time. On March 12, 2021, the US chapter of WDI sent a letter to Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer, signed by thousands of Declaration signatories all over the world, explaining how devastating the Equality Act would be to women and girls globally. We sent that letter directly to the email address of one of his staffers, who confirmed that she received it and told us that she would make sure that he saw it. On March 16, 2021, we submitted written testimony opposing the Equality Act to every member of the US Senate Judiciary Committee and received written confirmation that our testimony had been received. We did not share either our letter to Majority Leader Schumer or our Senate Judiciary Committee testimony directly with Representative Cicilline. However, Majority Leader Schumer is the top Democrat in the US Senate, and he supports the Equality Act. A majority of the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee are Democrats, and they all voted to pass the Equality Act in March 2021. Although we have no direct evidence that Representative Cicilline saw either our letter to Majority Leader Schumer or our Senate Judiciary Committee testimony, it is very difficult for us to believe that he did not. Both our letter and our testimony quoted the Declaration at length. 2 months later, Representative Cicilline introduced the American GRA in the US House of Representatives. Finally, Representative Cicilline has been endorsed by the Human Rights Campaign at least since his initial bid for Congress in 2010. For all of these reasons, we highly suspect that Representative Cicilline's intention in introducing the American GRA was to target Declaration signatories and their families globally and bar them from entry into the United States. Even if that was not the intention of the bill, we are confident that this law, if enacted, could easily be used to accomplish that objective. Conclusion. The American GRA has gotten almost no media attention. The Human Rights Campaign loves it, as do the president and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but most media outlets simply aren't covering it. A thorough analysis of how this bill might impinge on the Bill of Rights, other constitutional provisions, and the rest of US existing law would be a worthy endeavor. For example, the First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of association might be implicated, as well as the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. The bill also arguably gives the president unchecked power, which could invoke the separation of powers doctrine. The purpose of this paper is simply to call attention to the bill itself and to WDI USA's concerns with it, and to make it known to declaration signatories all over the world that Representative David Cicilline does not want us here. WDI USA thinks that this is without question one of the most anti-woman and authoritarian pieces of legislation that we have seen in our lifetimes. We speculate that it is intended to target declaration signatories all over the world and their families, and to bar them from entering the United States, and possibly worse. Even if that is not its intention, it will almost certainly be used to target declaration signatories if it becomes law. We speculate that US signatories could be targeted as well by alleging that we are operating as agents of declaration signatories outside the United States. We are proud to stand with our sisters all over the world, and we refuse to bow down to this blatantly authoritarian, patriarchal attempt to silence and punish women for fighting for the sex-based rights of women and girls. Thank you so much.
Hale Ake. She is a former academic from Turkey. Hale worked in human rights organizations for years, both as a volunteer and a professional. For the last 3 years, she has been active, especially on social media, in debates concerning trans rights. She's going to tell us about what's happening in Turkey.
I will be talking on behalf of an expanding group of women from Turkey, who in the last 3 years have found themselves in the middle of a fierce debate on gender identity ideology, and are nowadays trying to get organized to fight against it in a more effective way. So I think most of you know that the situation of women and girls is grim in Turkey, with a hostile government which last year withdrew from what is popularly known as the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention, and is now seeking ways to undercut women's alimony rights. There is little protection when it comes to the rights of sexual minorities. Pride marches have been banned since 2015, and following a coup attempt in 2016, the government has left little room for freedom of assembly and speech. LGBTQ organizations have been targeted continuously by the government, and the repression on LGBTQ groups increases as they become more visible. Legal changes that can curb women's sex-based rights, especially those that may be related to female-only spaces, is a remote possibility in our current political and social environment. So you might think that in such a setting, the issue of gender identity and the debates around trans rights should have little relevance for us. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Turkey has become a perfect example of countries where gender ideology is spreading rapidly, and a particular brand of feminism is gaining dominance on women's issues to such an extent that it can pose a threat to women's rights and visibility, as if they are already under risk. Many of us became aware of this ideological capture 3 years ago when a group of activists protested a social media post of a women's group that celebrated the birthday of Nettie Stevens, who discovered sex chromosomes. They said it was transphobic. They then targeted a feminist academic because of a single sentence starting with the words, women and trans women. She was immediately labeled as transphobic and was accused of being a biological essentialist in a program on an online news platform. She later apologized, repeated the phrase, trans women are women, as instructed, and advised all of us to consider our privileges as women. Following that, a list of 5 TERFs, including myself, began to be circulated. In my case, what I did was to write a fairly mild Twitter thread on the NF case in Canada, warning people that in Turkey, we did not need this toxic debate. Almost immediately, a feminist and now a prominent GRA, whom I barely knew, called me transphobic and said that I should be discredited and defamed. In our group of 5 women, only 2 knew each other before. The list included a philosophy professor who said on Facebook that women and trans women go through different socialization processes during their adolescence. A former student of hers who studied transhumanism in her PhD and shared some critical views about hormone blockers. And 2 socialist feminists who each wrote one critical article about this debate. We came from very different backgrounds, had different political views on other issues. And at the time, there were some 20 to 30 women active on social media who also said very simple things like biological sex is real and women are oppressed as a sex class. At the time, we thought that the debate will soon die down. I mean, why should we be talking day and night about issues that are a thing of the West? We were naive. Soon we realized that, in fact, we were facing a deliberately organized attack. Those trans activists are now dominating all LGBTQ organizations in Turkey. They already received grants. They were running workshops to talk about the activism against TERFs, and they only needed to find some TERFs. They did not want to target the powerful figures of what I call the feminist establishment in Turkey. They needed soft targets like us, who they thought that they could easily silence and discredit so that they can show all other women what would happen to them if they are to counter the gender ideology. We were also naive to assume that women's rights organizations and feminists in Turkey would speak up. They did not. No women's groups publicly condemned the online vitriol and bullying we were being faced with. Instead, many rushed to social media to virtue signal their compliance to this ideology. Almost a year later, in June 2020, the 5 of us, along with J.K. Rowling, were nominated LGBT community's annual genetically modified tomato awards for our transphobia. Thanks to the efforts of some feminists working behind closed doors, Rowling was awarded the prize, not a woman from Turkey. Right after the prize ceremony, a prominent activist of the feminist establishment I mentioned earlier wrote an article to explain why we deserve to be called TERFs, saying that by objecting to self-ID and trans people's inclusion in women's single-sex spaces, we spread a toxic rape fear. Meanwhile, a growing number of women started to actively resist this ideological capture, but the public barely understood what we were talking about. A few among us saw the fact that the best tactic against trans activists was to popularize the subject. For months, we shared the news around this issue in Turkish. In Turkey, where 90% of the media, mainstream media, is controlled by the government, and with only a few popular opposition media outlets, social media is now where people get their news. It is where the conversation happens. That tactic worked, and the content we put on social media slowly started to shift the balance of the debate. You might find it funny, but active users of social media in Turkey have the most up-to-date information about what is going on in the West around this issue. In fact, if you can read Turkish social media, you would think that this gender identity issue is one of the most important problems of our country. A turning point was on March 2021. As in some other countries, we have demonstrations organized a few days before March 8 for International Women's Day. In the demonstration in Istanbul on March 6 last year, the organizers platformed 3 trans-identified males. 2 of them had used violence against women before and were allowed to speak, even though one of them had publicly confessed what he had done. We also have night marches organized on March 8. Before that, some trans activist groups declared that they would be protesting TERFs during that march, and many attended with placards against us. And during this march, it became visible that the feminist movement in Turkey was somehow colonized by the LGBTQ community, with many men walking alongside women, and the Women's March looking more and more like a pride march. Some women were harassed sexually during that march. We tried to challenge the organization committee in Istanbul. They never responded. During the Pride Month in June, the LGBT organizations again nominated some of us for the previously mentioned awards, but this time it did not hurt that much because now we were being surrounded by newcomers on social media who since then have been fiercely countering this ideology. I should underline that most of these women are very young. Many of them are university students. We are a diverse group in terms of ethnic and religious identity, and there are many young lesbians and bisexual women among us. Then came another turning point. In Turkey, there are campaigns against an 18% value-added tax on menstrual products, which are categorized as luxury goods. This fall, a women's group shared a post on social media asking for the abolition of this tax using the term people with vulvas. A few days later, United Nations Population Fund's Turkey branch shared a similar post. In Turkish, they use the term people who have periods. In English, they instead said menstruators. Suddenly, more women started to realize the fact that the word women was being erased. As this year's International Women's Day was approaching, they also saw that the word women was absent in social media posts, inviting women to join protests and marches. Even pressing issues on women's rights were to a large extent excluded. So it became all about transphobia and homophobia. In some discussions on Twitter Spaces, which is very popular in Turkey, some of us were directly threatened. Many women started to share their concerns about a possible physical encounter between them and trans activists in upcoming events. For the first time, a group of feminists from older generations intervened and shared a statement denouncing the intimidation of women and calling for a principled debate among feminists. Around the same dates, two persons, one is self-identifying as non-binary and the other as a trans woman, tried to enter the women's changing room in a sports club in Aydın. This is a city in southwest Turkey. So we didn't have much choice. We needed to get organized. In a short period of 10 days, we first shared our own statement inviting women to march with us on March 8th. We designed our banner which read, "We are women, we are angry." We were organized in three main states. In Ankara, during the march on Tuesday, trans activists tried to intimidate our friends and tore our banner. In Istanbul, where the police was more brutal, they tried to harass them, and one self-identified trans woman insulted one of our friends, telling her to eat her dick. Again, the organization committee in Istanbul supported this person instead of women, and apparently this group of feminists are targeting us, helping efforts to demonize us, but also insulting us as nobodies who do not even deserve any communication. So here we are now. We are a very loose network of women from Turkey. And given the situation in the country, and given the fact that up to that moment, we already did what could be done on social media, we are trying to decide how to progress. We discuss options for creating more content in Turkish, not only that issue, but also on other topics that come as a package with this brand of feminism. We have little leverage on feminist circles inside the country. We believe we should also look for options to join any international effort we can contribute. Of course, we are open to suggestions, and any opportunity that can amplify our voice will be very helpful. Some of you might still wonder how trans rights issue could dominate feminism in Turkey and why feminists and women's organizations are silent. In our country, nearly all of them are financed by foreign donors and depend on grants. This is now also the case for many opposition media outlets. This creates an environment of self-censorship on this issue. Moreover, since 2015, most of these donors see the LGBT community as those at most risk. And most of the financial support spared for gender equality issues are allocated to LGBT causes or projects that ties women's issues and LGBTQ issues. In countries like us, I mean those that are EU candidate countries or under the umbrella of EU's neighborhood policy, the Council of Europe sets the agenda on human rights issues, and the moment the Council started using the term gender identity, it suddenly became the norm, and all organizations updated their guidelines accordingly. Suddenly, without much guidance and collaboration, all civil society organizations have found themselves in line with this ideology, and they think that objecting to it might have consequences. Of course, it's not only about money. There are many feminists and women's rights advocates who oppose the demands of trans activists, but do not want to join a public discussion thinking that it is against the ethical principles of feminists. Some find the debate absurd, some think it will disappear in a few years, and find engaging in it as counterproductive. Others do not follow the discussions and still perceive trans people as old school transsexuals who have always been a part of women's movement in Turkey in some ways. Some see trans activism as a tool to extend their influence. Moreover, you might also think that young people in Turkey are less affected from this gender war. That's also not the case. Many young people in Turkey are active on Reddit and Tumblr. They're also being indoctrinated and radicalized by a small but very active and noisy group of TRAs. In Turkish, we don't have gendered pronouns, but you can see many Turkish accounts that put on their bio their English pronouns. The term trans kids is now being promoted by activists, rights organizations, and some leftist outlets. Therefore, in a nutshell, we are also part of this culture war, though our social and political dynamics differ. Before ending, I would just like to say, for those of you who might be in touch with feminists and women's organizations in Turkey or in other similar countries, I would advise you to ask them their opinions about the conflict between women's rights and trans rights. Never assume that this war is not affecting them. In fact, many need to be awakened or be somehow pushed to take a clear stand about it. And thank you for listening.
Right, so we're going to now hear from Arusi. She's Arusi Unda from Mexico. She's going to talk about sexual and reproductive exploitation in Mexico, the only political scenario when they suddenly know what a woman is. Arusi Unda is a speaker of La Brujas del Mar, Witches of the Sea, feminist collective from Veracruz, Mexico. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Hermanas, muchas gracias por extenderme un espacio más en su maravillosa plataforma. El día de hoy quiero platicar un poco más de la situación en México, esta vez sobre el eje de la explotación sexual y reproductiva. Entre el preocupante incremento de llamadas de emergencia 911 pidiendo auxilio por casos de violencia machista, mujeres y niñas confinadas con sus agresores, fiscalías y ministerios públicos limitados en guardias ante sus de por sí insuficientes labores para proteger a víctimas de delitos, el cierre de refugios por recortes presupuestales para mujeres víctimas de violencia, institutos de la mujer sin recursos y siendo convertidos en institutos de la diversidad, un incremento histórico en cifras de feminicidios navegando por un clima de impunidad en el 98% de los casos, y la persecución y criminalización de activistas, feministas y defensoras de derechos humanos que trabajan incansablemente en acompañar a las mujeres y denunciar todo lo anterior, quiero hablar de un tema igual de alarmante y que convenientemente se habla por partes y a modo. En todo el mundo, este fenómeno afectó el desarrollo laboral y económico de millones de personas. Pero hablemos de cómo ha impactado esto en la vida de las mujeres. En México, según el Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía, 7 de cada 10 desempleados debido a la pandemia son mujeres. Y aunque se presume que la inserción va en aumento, la realidad es que no partimos de un escenario igualitario ni equitativo, pues desde antes las mujeres ya encabezábamos las cifras de falta de acceso a oportunidades y salarios dignos, empleo informal, desocupación y precarización. Esto afecta a las mujeres en un nivel sistemático. No solo se trata de no tener dinero, se trata de que la ausencia de autonomía económica hace casi imposible el poder considerar dejar al agresor, que usualmente es proveedor de servicios tan básicos como la comida y la vivienda. Además de no contar con recursos para tener las herramientas básicas y así salir de ciclos de violencia, desde poder pagar asistencia legal y psicológica hasta tener para las copias que solicitan en un trámite de denuncia o poder pagar el transporte público para llegar a una fiscalía. No existe esta perspectiva durante un proceso de denuncia por violencia en las instituciones que suponen proteger a las mujeres. No existe acompañamiento integral ni un pleno entendimiento de la realidad por la que atraviesan millones de mexicanas. Podrán entonces imaginarse las dificultades cuando esa mujer es indígena, no habla español y sus comunidades quedan lejos de los centros de atención a víctimas. De todo esto se habla poco, pero de lo que se habla todavía menos es de las cifras que modestamente se publicaron a la vez que las notas sobre pobreza y desempleo salieron a prensa a mediados del 2021 sin que nadie uniera los puntos. En lugares como la Ciudad de México, Puebla y Veracruz, el número de mujeres en situación de prostitución se ha incrementado a más del doble. Al momento no sé cómo han hecho esta contabilización al no haber una base estadística de mujeres en situación de prostitución en el país, y vaya que la he buscado. Leí las notas, leí cómo explicaban esta situación y cito: orilladas por el desempleo o por la quiebra de los pequeños negocios que habían emprendido, el número de trabajadoras sexuales incrementó. Si no les parece que sea lo suficientemente ilógico el llamarle trabajo a la explotación sexual de mujeres precarizadas, encima presumieron lo que llamaron el Corona Sutra, que no es otra cosa que una lista de posturas sexuales para evitar el contagio de coronavirus y poder atender a clientes. Mientras las mujeres no tienen más opciones para llevar pan a sus mesas o pagar la renta, los hombres todavía tienen dinero para comprar las voluntades y los cuerpos de las mujeres. Mientras a la ciudadanía se le pide sana distancia y medidas de higiene, a las mujeres empobrecidas les dan un catálogo para satisfacer los deseos sexuales de hombres desconocidos a los que ellas no desean y unos cuantos condones, si bien les va, para poder pagar la renta. Mientras a las personas se les pide confinamiento, las mujeres se vieron obligadas a pararse en las esquinas de las calles con todos los peligros que esto representa. Y en un país feminicida, el menor de estos es el coronavirus. Del otro lado de la misma moneda, a la vez que se reportaba el alarmante incremento de delitos cibernéticos, la violencia digital y la presencia de la delincuencia organizada en espacios virtuales, se celebraba que durante la pandemia el CEO de OnlyFans, Leonid Redvinsky, se volvió uno de los hombres más ricos del mundo, quien antes se dedicaba a vender contraseñas para sitios pornográficos, donde Forbes descubrió en una investigación que sus links llevaban a sitios de pedofilia, zoofilia y hardcore de menores. También lucró con las cintas sexuales de celebridades para después iniciar un servicio de pornografía a través de webcam que se volvió número 1 en el mundo. Dejando a un lado a este cuestionable hombre y volviendo a su proyecto actual, OnlyFans multiplicó 8 veces sus ganancias con respecto a 2019. Existen al momento 1.6 millones de usuarios, de los cuales el 97% de los creadores son mujeres y el 76% de los consumidores son hombres. Menos del 0.1% de creadoras no comparten contenido sexual. De las tarifas de sus contenidos, OnlyFans se queda con el 20%. Y así es como llegamos al proxenetismo moderno, donde cabe resaltar que según expertas en protección a menores no se han puesto los mínimos esfuerzos para evitar que menores de edad suban contenido de carácter sexual y que sean consumidos. El grooming al que someten a niñas cada vez a edades más tempranas, el capitalismo que exacerba el consumismo y el individualismo, la cultura de la violación, la educación sexual en manos de la pornografía, el catalogar a las mujeres como ciudadanas de segunda, en conjunto con la feminización de la pobreza, son caldo de cultivo para quienes se ven beneficiados con la compra y venta de mujeres en un negocio multimillonario, solo por debajo del tráfico de armas. Y esto no puede ser disociado de la trata de personas, y esta problemática exige la atención internacional que se merece, sobre todo en países que se emplean como rutas de captación y tráfico para la trata. Veracruz, el estado donde yo vivo, encabeza las cifras nacionales en desaparición forzada, siendo en su mayoría mujeres y más de la mitad de ellas menores de edad. A todo lo anterior se suma el grave problema que atraviesan las menores en condiciones precarias y comunidades indígenas, pues hace no mucho medios difundían la nota de que en la Sierra de Guerrero las niñas están siendo vendidas a hombres a modo que sus familias puedan subsistir como si de cabezas de ganado se trataran. El presidente ha decidido defender la autonomía de los pueblos originarios y los usos y costumbres antes que la integridad, la vida y la seguridad de las niñas indígenas de nuestro país. Y esto resulta en un racismo rampante y una permisividad a la pedofilia que debiera ser intolerable, sugiriendo que esas niñas no son ciudadanas ni sujetas de derecho como cualquier otro mexicano. ¿O es que los derechos humanos no son universales? Esto no solo pasa en la Sierra de Guerrero, que debiera ser suficientemente grave, pero es el pequeño gran detalle del que nadie habla. Bajo este mismo tenor, la explotación de las mujeres y la comercialización de menores, tomando ventaja de la clara desigualdad económica, laboral y escolar, no termina ahí. La Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación lleva meses con el tema de retirar los candados que impiden la intervención de extranjeros y empresas en la mal llamada gestación subrogada, así como extender la invitación de regular esta práctica desde los congresos locales en diferentes estados, ya que se supone solamente está regulada al momento en Tabasco y Sinaloa. Dije se supone porque curiosamente es en Quintana Roo donde se centra la mayor cantidad de turismo reproductivo en el país. Y me preguntarán por qué esto es problemático, porque es problemática la idea de que las mujeres mayormente empobrecidas sean incubadoras de terceras personas que con ayuda de intermediarios que lucren con la explotación reproductiva incentiven el tráfico de menores en un país tan desigual, corrupto, misógino, pedófilo, y de donde se ha dejado claro que el interés mayor de los menores y de las mujeres no importa. Llama la atención también cómo la despenalización del aborto ha avanzado en México y en América Latina a pasos agigantados. Ese derecho que en mi país se ha exigido para todas las mujeres desde los 70s, desde que se menciona que en realidad es para personas gestantes, queda liberado. Algo huele mal, y lo relaciono con el esfuerzo que se le está poniendo a regular los vientres de alquiler en México, para que este no solo sea un paraíso de explotación sexual, como la famosa investigación de los Acapulco Kids, sino también para comenzar a edificar otro paraíso de tráfico de infancias y explotación reproductiva de mujeres empobrecidas con todas las de la ley, y que el Estado se lleve su parte en impuestos, por supuesto. Curioso cómo es que en los prostíbulos, en las granjas de vientres, en las ablaciones, en las bodas infantiles y en la pornografía, todos tienen clarísimo qué es una mujer. El sistema patriarcal no le deja muchas opciones a las mujeres ante un clima de pobreza, enfermedad y hambre. Y para que sea todavía más cruel, a las pocas opciones plagadas de violencia, riesgos a la salud, delincuencia organizada y muerte, pretenden llamarlas libre elección, altruismo o trabajo. Lo más grave es que una gran parte de la opinión popular lo cree, lo reproduce y lo defiende. Este es uno de los momentos de la historia moderna en que es más necesario que nunca defender con uñas y dientes que los derechos de las mujeres, sacudiéndonos el miedo de decir los derechos de las mujeres, sacudiéndonos el miedo de decir la verdad, quitándonos de encima la necesidad de agradar, poniéndonos del lado de las mujeres, haciendo del feminismo el movimiento social y político que los tiempos demandan, y no solo un eslogan vacío impreso en una camisa en una tienda de fast fashion. Es por esto que aprovecho este espacio que me han concedido para decir fuerte y claro que las mujeres ni en México ni en ninguna parte somos mercancía. No somos objeto del consumo masculino, somos sujetas de derecho. Y quiero pedirles encarecidamente, como mujeres que somos, que dejemos de pensar que existen mujeres de primera y de segunda. Que tengamos como fin la liberación de las mujeres, todas, del sistema patriarcal. Y en palabras de Audre Lorde, no seré libre mientras siga habiendo mujeres sometidas, incluso cuando sus cadenas sean diferentes a las mías. Thank you, everyone.
We're now going to move to Emma Bateman. Emma Bateman is the co-chair of the Green Party of England and Wales Women's Committee, and she is going to talk about the Green Party UK's position on women's sex-based rights. Thank you so much for coming, Emma, and over to you.
I'm the co-chair of the Green Party of England and Wales. It's not the UK. The Scottish Green Party is separate. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of what's been going on in the Green Party and what's happened to me as co-chair. Right, I've been a member of the Green Party for a very long time. I joined because of the Green Party's stance on nuclear power and nuclear weapons, though I didn't pay too much attention to their other policies because I assumed that being sensible and scientific on climate change, they were probably going to be against encouraging teenagers to seek salvation through a surgeon's knife. Now, one of the things I like about the Green Party is that it's founded on a brave philosophy of believing the best of people, of trusting that the majority of people are well-intentioned and wanting the best for themselves, their families, and the environment, but that this should not come at the expense of other people's lives and environments. Now, this is a great philosophy, and I don't disparage it, and it is counter to the conservative idea that everyone is selfish and out for their own gains. And it would be too easy, looking around us, to fall into the notion that life is indeed nasty, brutish, and short. So I really do value the kindness and tolerance that underpins Green Party philosophy. And we need that optimism, that recognition that another world is possible. But we also need to recognise that having a philosophy in which you must think the best of everyone is stunning and brave, but there has to be some mechanism in place for when people don't agree with you. The Green Party is so focused on being nice and listening to what people say they need so that we can win their vote through organic carrots and never the use of sticks because violence is always wrong, that we're flawed when people take advantage of that. And actually, not just when they take advantage, but when they don't see that they are asking too much, that their needs are greater than is reasonable to ask others to accommodate. And this is difficult because we don't like to see people in pain and we don't like to think of ourselves as people who say no. Now, I've been wondering about how to approach this talk because this is a new territory for me. I have launched a legal action against the Green Party. I have a crowdfunder, and I feel sad that it has come to this. And I'm not certain what I can say about the Green Party given this legal action. I know that I have to be careful and guarded with my words, and it feels that if I put a step wrong, there could be a big consequence. I'm trying to second guess where my words might end up and whether I'll cause damage to myself or colleagues by speaking. I'm self-censoring and toning things down so that I don't capsize a boat that is already pretty rocky. And while the legal action is certainly new territory for me, the other feelings I've just described are not. I'm sure that many women here know the anxiety of being uncertain, careful, tentative about whether it is okay to say that women are adult human females. And now I will skim through my descent into turfdom. I became aware of trans ideology in 2017 after Helen Steele was thrown out of the Anarchist Book Fair, and none of that made sense because Helen was quite rightly a bloody heroine, and I had been to the Anarchist Book Fair and I knew the good work done by some of the people who run it. And a few months later, I'd spent so much time in the rabbit hole that I felt like I'd met Bugs Bunny, Jessica Rabbit / Peter Rabbit, and the whole Watership Down crew. I had contorted my language so that I never spoke of men in dresses, only male-bodied people who have the gender identity of a woman. I had twisted my brain around the arguments about not being able to be sure about anyone's sex because it's so complex. And I'd been made to feel that my concern for women's rights and safety was some kind of seedy genital fetish. Now, those of you who have been down this path know that it is bruising, and you end up doubting yourself and seriously questioning whether you are the bad guy. But I am content now that while I may be far from perfect, I am not a far-right, bigoted, racist anti-Semite who is responsible for the deaths of trans people. Now, I've been on the Green Party Women Committee since October 2019, and I've been a co-chair for most of that time. I was elected at the first Green Party conference I'd ever been to, and I was hanging on the coattails of my friend and co-chair, Dawn Furness, whose head was above the parapet way before mine, and who has stood at the forefront and taken the force of the blow. After that conference, my friend Jessica was also made to run the gauntlet of multiple complaints from a leading Green Party member for having the nerve to organise an unofficial fringe with a star lineup of Stephanie Davis-Arai, Miranda Yardley, Linda Bellis and Heather Brunskill-Evans. The Green Party Women Committee soon got into trouble for objecting to parliamentary candidates calling women TERFs. And then we committed the sin of expressing sympathy for J.K. Rowling when she was being humiliated and vilified, and far too many people thought it was probably not okay for her ex-husband to slap her, but if she will go around saying mean things like, I know and love trans people, what can you expect? For the 2020 Green Party women elections, the big guns were rolled out with the deputy leader, ex-MEPs, the co-chair of the Young Greens and several Green Party councillors all standing on a platform to take Green Party women in another direction, i.e. away from the TERFs. I think it is fair to say that many members regarded that direction as downhill, given that the committee achieved virtually nothing all year, though 2 committee members did manage to get me suspended in March 2021 for 5 months because I asked the terrifying question, are trans women biological females? Asking this question was deemed to make me an immediate danger to the party, and the evidence given of my transphobia included my entire Twitter feed. Now, the no-fault suspension was revoked in August 2021 when the Mayor Forstater ruling came in that suggested that despite popular opinion in some parts of the Green Party, we are not Nazi adjacent just because we know sex matters. The complaint that I was suspended for has not actually been heard yet because the wheels of justice turn slowly in the Green Party, and some may say that the wheels are coming off. I can't possibly comment because if I do, that will end up as another complaint, and that is not really going to help improve the situation. Though I was unsuspended, the majority of the committee believed it was untenable to have to share Zoom space with me because I am apparently so terrifying. Now, I am the first to admit that I am not at all photogenic, but I think that it is a little far-fetched to say that I have the power to cause actual harm to people through the medium of Zoom. I would like to think that the gender ideologists learned that it did not reflect well on them when they shut down the Green Party women for virtually the whole of the year. And when I say shut down, I mean it, because the Green Party women member space, which is for members only and is not public facing, was shut down, and all the posts made throughout the last several months were deleted by a single committee member who deemed that everything was riddled with transphobia. This was a very unusual move, and I think the only other time a space has been shut down like this was in January 2021, when the gender critical Green space was deleted in its entirety without warning by the Green Party CEO. The member who set up that space has been on a no-fault suspension for over a year and is still waiting for that complaint to be heard against him. Now, I was re-elected on January the 21st, 2022, but by January the 25th, a complaint by a leading Green Party member had already been submitted calling for my suspension again. Because of that complaint, I was duly suspended again on a no-fault suspension on February the 4th this year. And that suspension will be continually rolled over until the disciplinary committee get around to hearing it. My transgressions in the Green Party are not limited to saying males are not female and people can't change sex, though. I've also upset a number of members by bringing a motion to conference 3 times on ensuring sex and gender are not conflated. The synopsis is as follows. Ensuring sex and gender are not conflated. Sex refers to biology, which is immutable. Gender is a social construction. Discrimination against women may be based on their perceived sex. However, there are aspects of discrimination females face based on sex, not gender. To address discrimination, it is imperative that accurate sex-segregated data is collected. Now, this motion was condemned as anti-trans by Sian Berry, co-leader of the Green Party, the Young Greens and the LGBT Greens, and they all urged people not to vote for it because it is apparently against Green values, though I thought as a party of science we would welcome accurate data collection. The second time I brought the motion to conference was spring 2021, where it was due to be debated. Then, a few minutes before it was supposed to be heard, the chair of that session decided to strike it from the agenda on a technicality. This caused considerable consternation and led to various complaints going back and forth. 8 months later, I received an apology from the Standing Orders Committee who decide these matters. They said the motion could have been heard, but it wasn't. 2 days after that conference, on International Women's Day in 2021, I was suspended from the party. It transpired that I was actually supposed to have been suspended the day before conference started, but the admin staff did not get around to telling me, and there were moves made to try and prevent me from speaking at conference at all. In September 2021, the Scottish Green Party Women's Network and Rainbow Greens publicly castigated the Green Party Women Committee on Twitter for supposedly submitting a response to the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform consultation sometime in 2019 or 2020. Now, the majority of the Green Party Women Committee in 2021 were fully on board with the Trans Women Are Female motion, and they very swiftly moved to condemn the former committee too for our transphobic act of submitting a response to an open consultation. Now, the thing is, we did not actually submit that response to the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform consultation. Someone did so in our name, but it was not the committee. And if the Scottish Green Party Women's Network had bothered to ask that before going after us in public with their accusations, we could have explained that to them. Now, they called the submission transphobic. Of course they did. But the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform consultation introduction states that it would vet responses and disallow any responses that contain transphobia. So it appears that until the Scottish Greens agitated about it, the transphobia was not apparent to the Scottish government. Now, there are a few other things about this, but suffice to say that things got a bit rocky between the Scottish Green Party and the Green Party of England and Wales. And then when our Green Party members had the cheek to re-elect me this year with a large majority, the Scottish Greens were not pleased and threatened to cut ties with the Green Party of England and Wales. The Scottish Greens allege that my transphobia is plain to see because I signed the WDI, and everyone who does so is automatically a bigot and a transphobe. I cannot say for sure what was said to appease the Scottish Greens, but the motion to cut ties with the Green Party of England and Wales was withdrawn, and the Scottish Greens seemed very pleased with the assurances of our leaders in tackling the pesky transphobes in the Green Party of England and Wales. Since then, we've had the rollout of the LGBTQIA plus Greens training/re-education programme. There is no equivalent training from Green Party women on what a woman is, which is odd, as leading Greens appear to struggle with that one. And more recently, I committed the sin of standing for women in the vicinity of the notorious Posy P at Speaker's Corner, where I said such outrageous things as, "I don't agree with everything Posy says," and "some people in the Green Party are intolerant of any view they disagree with." And it has been supposed that this appearance led to my current suspension. It did not. The suspension had already been decided on a complaint prior to that appearance because of the things I said around the Green Party women election, which are all in the public domain, though I believe that I have collected another couple of suspensions as a result of my appearance at Speaker's Corner. And to bring us up to date, last weekend, the Green Party of England and Wales held its spring conference. Annie Stafford Townsend is the non-binary female co-chair of Green Party Women, who, since I've been ousted as the other co-chair, has taken a somewhat authoritarian approach to the role. She proposed the late motion to conference, which called for all members of the Green Party who had signed the WDI to be permanently suspended from the Green Party. It included the following text. The Green Party accepts that the gender critical movements in most UK political parties have been infiltrated by hardline extremists who advocate for the wholesale removal of virtually all trans rights as currently enshrined in the Equality Act 2010, and routinely share platforms with those who advocate for extremist positions, such as the mass sterilisation of trans people. These extremists have also been linked with attacks on women's abortion rights, misinformation designed to provoke hatred towards trans people, and have benefited from funding from the far right. The Green Party condemns hardline anti-trans activists, including signatories of the Women's Declaration International. Now, I'm pleased to say that this motion was wrestled out of the agenda, which I hope is a small green shoot of reasonableness prevailing in the party, though as Cara said, the majority was small, and 42% of members did vote to keep this motion included in the agenda. And we have a long way to go. Gender critical members are still being routinely framed as bigots and transphobes, and a whole host of local parties are bringing forward statements to condemn transphobia, whether expressed outright, through dog whistles, or under the guise of debate and reasonable concerns. How dastardly of members to try and trick people into being transphobic with their reasonable sounding arguments and debate. There is no place for that kind of thing in a progressive political party. Now, being on a no-fault suspension means being stuck in limbo with no end date. I cannot take part in any Green Party activities, and people are allowed to write all kinds of things about me with impunity all over the member space. I think the party were hoping I would just leave, but I'm not going to do that because I can already see how the next set of gender critical Green Party women are being lined up for public humiliation and vilification. Officers of the party are publicly naming them as supporters of torture and as right-wing extremist reactionary factions opposed to the party progressive policies. These women are my friends, and I'm not going to stand by and let the same thing happen to them as has happened to me, Dawn Furness, Deborah Fink, Claudine Lettsay, Robbie Spence, Andy Healy, to name but a few. I fully expect to collect a few more complaints as a result of some of the things I have said here today to add to the fistful I have already, but it makes little difference to me now. I cannot see the party allowing me back in because I might frighten the more delicate members. But I have to fight because I'm incensed by the idea of women being put through the ringer for understanding the reality of our lives as female, and of teenage girls being made to feel uncomfortable and unkind for wanting the privacy of a female-only space when they're getting changed, or being made to feel that they have some kind of privilege over straight white men because they are lucky enough to have been born female. There are some fantastic people in the Greens who have worked their 100% organic cotton socks off to build a compassionate, earth-centred party, and I'm not prepared to slip quietly out of the way, especially as I've had 4 years of being called a TERF and a transphobe, so I've grown a tough carapace. And if I walk away, some other member is going to be made into a target, and I don't want to see other women have to go through the toughening process and to have to grapple with the fact that however confident you are that you're a decent person, it's hard not to be affected at all by the people calling you a racist, right-wing, anti-Semitic, transphobic bigot. Women who just want to have a space to run a book club and yoga sessions and talk about the climate do not deserve to have chunks taken out of them for knowing that sex matters. The Green Party has 50,000 members, most of whom are oblivious to this party rancor. Those who do know need to recognise that whilst this could have been a side issue of seeking of compromise over competing rights, it has become a central issue, and the Green Party cannot pull together on climate change whilst it is being ripped apart over women's rights.